Again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Women, Peace, and Cybersecurity Elective. I'm pleased at this time to welcome the moderator, Dr. Chris C. Demchak. Dr. Demchak is a professor of Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Demchak, podium is yours.
Well, hello. Moderators are supposed to keep things going and to be quiet, but I'm an academic, so there are several things you never give academics. One of them is time to speak or pens. They will steal your pens as well. So today we're going to talk about an important topic is, women, peace, and cyber security. You will note in my title, those are two words. That is because I have in the background national security. And so we're going to focus on the contributions of women, but also the ways in which if we don't get it right in the cyber world, it actually hurts that other half of the population and then the rest of the society. So in that regard, I have to give you one important point. We've lost a fourth member. Colonel Hamdi of the Tunisian Special Forces is not going to be with us. They had some circumstances in which he could not attend. But that means I've given our speakers more time. And
clarified what you meant by lost, because it sounded a little grim there.
Special Forces lost, yeah, okay. No, I mean, he's off solving some other great point in the universe. We have, and I will not be introducing people because you are supposed to all know how to use QR codes. By the way, you know that you can actually corrupt QR codes. Just want a public service announcement there. Okay, ours aren't, as far as I know. So we have Ms. Anne Schumann, who is the principal cyber advisor for the Secretary of the Navy. And yes, it is spelled wrong. That's what happens when you believe Apple and you've quoted things to Apple, okay? Be careful. Second thing, and I'm really looking forward to your thoughts because she's been in the position now
7 months.
7 months, so long enough to be scared, okay? And to have some really good ideas, not beat out of her yet. So this is a good time to talk to her. Dr. Alexis Henshaw, who's an associate professor at Troy University and has written a lovely paper. So if you're interested at the other end, you should ask her for a copy. It's quite interesting. And Lauren Buitta, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Buitta, thank you. Who is CEO and founder of Girls Security. And we don't that often get people that have the initiative, drive, and skill to create their own organization here in a commercial world, particularly in cyber. So I hope you will use this opportunity to really query her on any point she's made or hasn't made. With that, I would like to welcome, I keep wanting to call you Dr. Schumann. You just seem like you should be.
Thank you. I mean, I will take like an honorary.
Okay, honorary Dr. Schumann. I'm a Hopper Chair here of cybersecurity, and by that, I now have made you Dr. Schumann. Absolutely, everyone on this panel has now been given an honorary doctorate, and treat them kindly, please.
All right. I hope it's okay if I just sit and keep it casual, or do we need to go? Okay, excellent. All right. So thank you very much for the introduction. I am Anne-Marie Schumann, Department of Navy Principal Cyber Advisor. Despite the fact that in the written program it said Principal Advisor for Cybersecurity, I have to point out that no, Principal Cyber Advisor. Why? Because it matters what you append to cyber. In this case, there's nothing appended to it, which means that I get to look at everything cyber for the Department of the Navy. All right, so I was really excited to get this invite to speak at the WPS Symposium, but quickly realized that I didn't know anything about WPS. I mean, really, truly had not picked up an article, maybe had heard it in passing. So therefore, I hadn't thought at all about how this framework could or would apply to cyber writ large and specifically to the Department of the Navy's cyber initiatives. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity coming along, forcing me to do some academic research of my own into what that framework is, how the UN is looking at the subsection of women, peace, and cybersecurity, and what others have said about women, peace, and cybersecurity that may or may not apply to the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of war, and then to the peacekeeping and security roles as well that we play. So to start, I'd like to reflect a little bit on my role as the principal cyber advisor and just take you along sort of this learning journey that I had for WPS and how I think it applies, where we're talking about it in the DoD now, and then where I think we need to go next in terms of research and application to policy and operations. So starting off, as I said, my purview is really broad as the principal cyber advisor. I get to kind of open up anything in the Department of the Navy with cyber appended to it and look at how that is supporting or not my primary mission, which is to enable maritime dominance through cybersecurity. And I do that primarily through three pillars or priorities that the SecNav has given to me. That is securing our defense critical infrastructure, think ports and bases, installations, that does have a relationship to civilian critical infrastructure. Obviously, we depend on power and water and other critical utilities out there in our communities. The second pillar, surviving cyber attacks afloat. That's the shorthand, but I will say my interest doesn't end afloat. It is also aloft and subsea as well. So that's a very platform-centric look, and all the weapon systems that go on those platforms as well. And finally, striking with a ready cyber mission force. So this has to do with the Department of Navy's role in manning, training, and equipping cyber forces, for Cybercom and for our own Navy and Marine Corps retained cyber missions. Now, this is pretty broad. The Department of Navy does have a cyber strategy. You can Google it. It's unclassified, publicly available, that provides some lines of effort that guide how we implement these priorities. So when I first got the invitation, I thought, oh my gosh, I've done my reading on WPS now. How does it apply to us? My North Star is always that cyber strategy. So I went Control F for women. Take a guess at how many times women appeared in our cyber strategy. Zero. And Alexis made me feel a little better as she's done some research to look at other policies and strategies. We're not alone. This is not uncommon that women are not called out specifically. I believe in our national security strategy, women get a grand one mention. It is in terms of improving STEM education access for women and girls. So I was really kind of on my own. Had no easy button to hit to figure this out. And I had to start thinking about how my three priorities fit in with the WPS framework in participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. And from my perspective, the primary way that the Department of Defense has been focusing on this or intersecting with WPS in cyber is through that participation line of effort, right? We talk a lot about how we increase women in the workforce, increase access to STEM, how we promote, women in our cyber operations, but probably not so much on the protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. So I'll talk about those at the end as areas of further research. And I have some specific questions I'd like to get into. So. All right. On specifically this participation lens for WPS, I think a lot of organizations and states tend to view the cyber domain primarily through a technology lens. That's an easy trap to fall into. The WPS framework requires us to look through a human lens. And I do think in this, the Department of Navy is aligned because when you look at our cyber strategy, the very first line of effort has to do with our workforce and a recognition that people are more important than technology, that humans are our greatest resource, and that we have to have a CMF that is both highly skilled and diversely skilled. So I liked the quote earlier today, and I can't remember who referred to this, but from CNO Zoomwalt about the importance of the skills that women bring to the mission and the recognition of that. The bad news is that those are the same skill sets that the Amazons, Googles, and other major tech companies of the world are going after. And so whether you're talking men or women, it is really hard for us to go after a highly skilled and diversely skilled workforce. So one of the advantages that we have in the Department of the Navy is a unique value proposition whereby we can really look at aptitude rather than skill. And in theory, this should lower a barrier to women coming into our cyber operations force because we know that they are less represented in our STEM higher education. So if you focus on aptitude and you say, I will give you all the skills training you need if you have the aptitude and desire to serve, I would think that would produce pretty good outcomes. So let's take a look at some of the numbers. This morning, the Secretary of the Navy commented that about 20% of the Navy is women, about 10% of the Marine Corps. So when we look at our cyber ratings and designators, we're at about 18% women for our maritime cyber warfare officers, 15% for our cyber warfare technicians, so that's officer and enlisted for Navy, 11%, so above the general population for Marine Corps, 11% for Marine Corps cyber officers are women, 4% are enlisted. And I have to go back and do some further digging, but I think that 4% may be close to in line with the total percentage of women enlisted in the Marine Corps, but I need the current numbers. So in general, we have some work to do to improve there on closing the gap between the overall numbers of women represented in the service and the numbers that we have in uniform for cyber enlisted and officers. So, you know, this bullet, my staff helped me with these slides. We care about our people, of course, right? They wanted to put that on there, but caring clearly isn't enough, and the strategies that we have been employing are clearly not enough. So we really have to get at some of the underlying causes because this isn't just a recruiting problem, although that is a problem overall. It's an operational effectiveness problem when you talk about women, peace, and cybersecurity. So some of the specific roadblocks to participation that I am looking at. The first is simply generating interest, right? And we have a problem when it comes to generating interest. A survey of girls under 16 in the EU, US, and Israel found that 78% had never considered a career in cyber. Pair that with another study that found that in middle school, about 27% of girls in the US had considered a career in technology, but by high school that had dropped to 18%. So we're losing interest as girls progress through their education. When I look at the Department of Navy's STEM outreach programs, they tend to be concentrated at the high school level and more so at the college level. So we're getting to girls at the wrong age. It needs to be at the elementary, the primary level, and the middle school level where we're engaging to generate that interest. Another thing that I would like to work on, changing perception. All right, this perception, when you say cyber or cyber operations officer, people think hacker, right? Think of, there's a stereotype about kind of the lone, typically male, in a hoodie on a keyboard hacking something. That is not a useful stereotype, right? Other stereotypes in the cybersecurity arena include geeks, nerds, tech bros, things that are not always true, right? We've got a perception problem. 55% of women believe that cybersecurity is an intimidating field. I would say partially because of the focus on these stereotypes and on technology. 51% don't think that there's room for someone like them. Right. At one point, I probably would have counted myself among them. I'm not a cyber operations officer by background. I'm an Intel person with a liberal arts degree. Probably the last line of code that I wrote was like changing the color on my MySpace page. It's a misperception that you have to have technical skills to be somehow involved in the cyber field, right? And that goes to my next point about creating opportunities. There are a plethora of opportunities in cyber policy, in research and education, in acquisition, in planning, in talent management, right? This is a broad and diverse career field, and we need folks to understand that and to fill all of those roles. And the final point that we have to look at is burnout and mental health. I mean, this is endemic in all of our workforce, but it's particularly bad in the cyber community. They're anywhere between, I think it was 60 to 80% of CISOs in one survey had said that they would consider quitting within the next year because of the level of burnout that they were experiencing. I've personally visited some of our cyber operations teams who are phenomenal. The operational pace is unsustainable, right? And they're suffering because of it. 69% of women said that well-being is an important consideration in a next job. So that makes it really hard not only to recruit, but once we do recruit, to retain the talent we have if we are burning through our cyber workforce. So, all right, I'll move on to, and I should have had a slide, but some of these thoughts really came together today listening to the presentations. Some of the ideas for research and where we need to go next. As I said, the protection, prevention, relief, and recovery parts of WPS, I don't hear those talked about a lot among my peer group in DoD. And so I think we need to focus there and start having some conversations. In the planning of cyber operations, we have to consider the effect of those operations on the half of the population that will experience them, and that those effects may be differentiated between men and women. Right? So for example, a cyber operation that shuts down the internet, right, might be good for hindering terrorist communications, but could have an outsized impact on women and their ability to report war crimes if they're using the internet for that. Now, I can't comment on whether Cybercom considers those factors in their planning or not. I don't know. I'd love to hear if somebody is here from Cybercom and knows, but that is something we should absolutely be looking at. In addition, as I started to think about the cyber domain, and I liked that somebody talked about gender as a domain earlier today. Cyber, as the only man-made domain, inherits the biases of its creators. In addition, the anonymity that's afforded by being on the internet enhances and amplifies the gender-based violence online. We heard about the increasing prevalence of SEA in conflict zones. We are also seeing an increased prevalence of online SEA in conflict zones. One example of this is a case study that was done looking at female Ukrainian refugees in Bulgaria and Russian information operations against them. These Russian information operations, using local Bulgarian news outlets, or what appeared to be, portrayed Ukrainian women as gold diggers who were trying to steal Bulgarian women's husbands for their passport, as prostitutes, as spreading HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, as obsessed with their looks and uninterested in working, and therefore leeching off the Bulgarian economy. The effect of this was that in communities where there was a high penetration of those information operations messages, the local communities were much more hostile to the Ukrainian women refugees. So there were true effects on the ability of Ukrainian women to integrate into these communities, to find work, to find acceptance in their refuge. So the final point I'll make, am I getting close on time?
You are doing fine.
Okay. The final point I'll make is that this domain, which is rife with misogyny, violent extremism, child sex abuse material, is one that our operators have to engage with on a daily basis. I don't think that we have come to terms with what that means for the mental well-being of our cyber operators who have to be in that environment, be exposed to that material, women and men, right? It may affect them differently. We don't know. There's no data. And then how, when they come back to the team environment that is a gender integrated team, does exposure to that affect the team and its operational effectiveness? So recognizing this lack of data, I am looking at leading a health wearables pilot in our cyber operations community to start to understand the stressors that our operators are facing. I acknowledge it's really sort of a small and very basic step. It falls far short of probably the depth of data we need to get after this problem. And we owe it to our sailors and Marines to do better, but at least it's sort of a first step. So I'll kind of stop there. I think I've taken enough time. Look forward to your questions and your ideas. Please, if you have ideas about how either the Department of Navy or the Department of Defense as a whole can better incorporate or should think about women, peace, and security in the context of cyber operations, I would love to hear about that. Thanks.
So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have everyone give their talks, and then we'll go to Q&A after that. So at this point, just thank you. Henshaw.
I'm gonna follow the norm and sit here if we get the.
Just click forward, it should come right up.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Alexis Henshaw. I'm an academic. I'll say that I sort of come more from a policy space and from a women, peace, and security space, but I've also done a lot of research on gender and extremism. And part of where this started to lead into cyber for me was with the COVID-19 pandemic, because of course, a lot of extremist terrorist uses, right, of discourse related to gender did not necessarily go away during the pandemic, but where did it move? It moved online. So few things that I'll talk about in this conversation is, why we should be adopting a perspective on cybersecurity that includes gender. Things that are related to that, like disinformation, which I think we've already heard about today, harassment, but also things like surveillance, right? And conspiracy theories that lead into extremism. These things have a long history online, and that has something to do with gender as well. talking about how cybersecurity issues can be experienced differently by women, minorities, also populations from the global south and LGBTQ populations, and then a little bit about what the role is for policy in addressing these issues. So I'll just kind of start off, doing my academic thing, right? This is, I think, how a lot of us come to understand the history of the development of cyberspace, right? That a lot of us know about the military role in developing the internet. A lot of us know about the importance of public-private partnerships, including academics in the creation and expansion of cyberspace. Some of us may also know about UN agencies that play a role in governance of the internet, things like domain name registrations, and, in line with the strategic competition conversation that we've been having a lot of here, we understand something about territorialization of the internet, right? That the internet is not what it was back in the 1990s. We have things like, the Great Firewall of China. We have, increasing concerns about the disinformation space, but also how other countries are moving towards territorialization of this space. But I would argue that there's a different way of understanding narratives in internet history. Part of that comes from the history of academic and expert communities as being co-creators of cyberspace as we know it today. Likewise, longstanding disinformation campaigns, things that gained a lot of traction during the COVID-19 pandemic, things like COVID-related conspiracy theories or anti-vaccine conspiracy theories derive from other health-related conspiracies that have been around on the internet, even going back to the 1990s. Likewise, we have early uses of cyberspace by insurgent actors. Any of you who are familiar with the insurgency in Mexico in 1994, this was one of the first times that we really had an insurgent group that was networking with, academics or people who were sympathetic to their cause to actually get their manifesto online and circulated so that people were talking about that. And then also early uses of cyberspace by civil society, like the campaign to ban landmines, which ran an international advocacy campaign to change international law in the 1990s using things like, Usenet groups, listservs, emails, things like that. So there's a different way of understanding the history. And I'd even go a step further from what we just heard about the cybersecurity workforce, right? Is that, I think we sort of see these gender inequalities today, but if we look at the sort of larger history of computing, right? How many of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures, right? How many of you know who Ada Lovelace is? Right? So these things are not just organic, right? There is a whole history out there of other actors who have contributed to cybersecurity or cyber insecurity as we know it today that I think we could have a larger picture of. So what kinds of things do we see, right? What sorts of threats or issues do we see when we look at that critical lens that maybe we don't necessarily always first come to mind when we talk about cybersecurity? Things like data privacy and surveillance is something that I think, arguably should be critically important to us. Incidentally, this is a place where in law and policy, we see an increasing divergence between the United States and European allies who have been much more aggressive about doing things like legislating data privacy. Proliferation of cybercrime and lack of state response, that's something that is, potentially worrisome to us. Here in the United States, we talk a lot about ransomware, right? But in other parts of the world, this is an issue as well. Thinking about the dominance of tech companies and tech content from the global north, going hand in hand with that, thinking about the availability and relevance of information in local languages. This is something that's been a priority, for example, in countries like India, right, is trying to get more information not just available to citizens and more services available to citizens online, but also trying to get that available in languages that are not English, right? Languages that people, actually speak in smaller communities so that information is useful to people. We've obviously seen the use of cyberspace to promote gender-based violence, right? And also ethnic violence as well. Promise and peril in the financial uses of cyberspace is one that's particularly interesting to me. I think we all love the convenience of digital payments, right? Something like Bitcoin that gets in the news a lot lately. We have 2 countries that have adopted Bitcoin as a national currency, one which quickly went back on it. But, you know, it's great to think about these things. But when we think about financial uses of cyberspace, we can also think about things like ISIS using Telegram to sell Yazidi women as slaves, right? And how that sorts of things are happening as well. Similarly, you know, even in relief and recovery, like we've talked about with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we've had systems and experiments go into place with UN agencies trying to use biometric information from refugees to assist in the dissemination of aid, which is, you know, a really fascinating application. But then we go back to the first bullet point there, right? What do we think about how that data is being used, right? What happens to it after a mission is over? So there are ethical concerns about that as well. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns, we've already heard a lot. But what I would argue is that each of these issues or factors really involves centering individual and community experiences of cybersecurity rather than the state, which we tend to so often think about. So this is why we can also sort of call this a human security approach to cybersecurity. So if we have these goals, right, if we're thinking about these issues, why can't we get to the kind of cyberspace that we would ultimately want to have? Well, there are technical challenges and there are also political challenges. One thing that I've heard from a lot of people who work in the social media space and also in preventing and countering violent extremism online is that, you know, misinformation and disinformation is gray speech. So it's very difficult to link some of that to formal extremist groups or to malicious state actors. And especially for the private actors who regulate cyberspace, especially social media communities, it becomes a very fine line to walk, right, between what looks like censorship and what looks like responsible content moderation. Similarly, going along with that, right, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had the decentralization of threats. And so what I mean by that is that it used to be when we talked about misinformation or disinformation campaigns online, we were talking about Facebook and Twitter, and that's it. Right. And now we have a plethora of other social media options to worry about. Right. But also, even beyond that, we have sort of channels on Telegram, channels on Discord, right? WhatsApp groups that are being used to spread election misinformation in different parts of the world. So it becomes infinitely more difficult to think about moderating some of those kinds of spaces. Likewise, linguistic diversity as well. One of the big surprises during the pandemic, especially with the spread of QAnon misinformation related to health and conspiracies and things like that, was that a lot of it was happening in English, but a lot of it was also happening in Spanish, in Portuguese, in German. At one point, Portuguese was one of the, I believe, the second or third most frequently used language on Telegram channels related to QAnon, which has huge impacts for Brazilian politics, right? It also has huge impacts for content moderation if you are a major social media company that does not employ Portuguese language speakers and that relies on AI to do a lot of this tracking. Similarly, I think something that we can think about more a lot within the past couple of years is the tech industry's neglect towards the gendered impacts of technology. So if we think about things like tracking tags, right, eye tags, things like that, those things were being used to enable domestic violence almost as soon as they came out, right? And the industry had to play catch up with the safeguards to install things like the tag beeps when you're being tracked by somebody for too long, right? So that you know that there's a tag there watching you. More recently, generative AI. Anyone in the room who has kids in K through 12 schools may know something about this, but the use of AI technology to create revenge pornography, fake pornography has been a huge thing in schools. And, you know, it's targeting women and girls especially. And once again, we see the industry starting to play catch up in terms of having to think about, like, how do we build in meaningful safeguards that are going to keep this from happening? So there are technical challenges to getting to the cyberspace that we want. There are also political challenges, right? So the lack of data protection regulations in some parts of the world arguably enables some of the abuses that we've just talked about. Likewise, laws play catch up to technologies like generative AI, right? As soon as we have one set of laws, there's a whole new generation of technology out there to deal with. Geographic spread of ideas, right? The fact that something like conspiracy theories cannot be easily controlled by a single state because this is a transnational dynamic. And then also regulating hate speech as well. So again, kind of walking that line between where do we draw the line between free speech and things that can possibly lead to militant or violent extremist behaviors. Some of the policy work that I've sort of looked at doing on this is seeing how countries actually understand or incorporate gender specifically into their cybersecurity policies. Part of the reason I wanted to look at this, so this is, I looked at 56 different cybersecurity strategies that were put forth by NATO countries between 2003 and 2022. And so some countries have multiple iterations of a policy during that period of time. Some countries only have one, but there's about 56 total. And one of the reasons why I was particularly drawn to looking at NATO countries is that NATO really has committed itself in high-level policy to dealing with at least some of the kinds of critical issues that we talked about before, right? To thinking about things like human security online, free and open cyberspace is something that NATO countries have committed to. Addressing violent extremism online, right? So these goals are out there, right? And there is also a nominal commitment to in the goal of pursuing free and fair, free access to cyberspace, also including civil society actors in that. So out of the 56 strategies that I looked at, you can see that there is some desire to sort of carry this out, right? There are 31 of those strategies that mentioned the need to prioritize human rights in cyberspace. So thinking about things like rights of access, free expression, things like that. There were 25 of the strategies that mentioned specifically the need to have outreach to civil society groups as stakeholders, which can include women's organizations, right? It can include organizations that are dealing with things like domestic violence. But there were only 11 strategies that specifically mentioned gender as being an issue that is related to that. And even out of those 11 strategies that mentioned gender, some of them really just mentioned gender, right? Like somewhere down the road, we have a women's ministry that we're going to invite to participate in a conversation, but we don't really have any more specific ideas than that. So really out of the NATO countries and the NATO strategies that I looked at, I would argue that the idea of incorporating gender into cybersecurity is still in its infancy. And there are only a couple of countries that are really looking at it in a meaningful way. Two specific examples that I would like to sort of highlight here. The UK has made strides in terms of including or addressing gender, not only in its top level national cybersecurity strategy, but in other documents and initiatives related to cyber as well. Some of the things that they're doing, they have increased funding for education for women in cyber, so scholarships and things like that. They have devoted themselves to trying to study and address industry pay gaps between men and women. And interestingly, they've also looked at using foreign aid to support gender mainstreaming in cybersecurity abroad. And so one of the specific things that the UK partnered with, I believe the Netherlands and also Australia and a couple of other countries to do is that they supported training programs for women working in civil service in countries throughout the global south to actually train them about cybersecurity issues, and then to also fund their participation in UN meetings related to cybersecurity. And as a direct result of that initiative, we recently, within the past couple of years, had a UN a UN meeting of a cybersecurity working group that reached gender parity for the first time because of that sort of initiative that was out there. So that's one way that we could think about, going about mainstreaming gender in cybersecurity. Another sort of interesting example is that Luxembourg has also, really committed itself to discussing gender in a sustained way throughout multiple national cybersecurity strategies. They have, set aside state funding for funding women-owned businesses and tech startups specifically. Like the UK, they're studying gaps, gender gaps, not just in, things like pay, but also access gaps, right? So how many men versus women are actually getting internet access to the internet on a regular basis? And then similarly, also streamlining and reporting the removal of harmful content is something that Luxembourg has committed to doing in some of its strategies. Luxembourg is really interesting because it not only has a national cybersecurity strategy, but it also has a national strategy to, create a more inclusive internet, which I think is a really interesting approach to that as well. So these are just two examples that I talked about, but there are others as well. If you want to go outside the NATO space, Ireland has also, been investing, especially in reaching refugee women to try and train them to get into the cyber workforce and cyber jobs and things like that. Spain, likewise, is another country that has created a national cybersecurity strategy that specifically talked about removing harmful content in terms of child exploitation and pornography, but they then used that funding and mechanism to also address things like revenge pornography as well. So there are some countries that are really, potentially taking novel ways of becoming sort of norm leaders in this area. So there are good starts, right? What I would argue is missing from gender mainstreaming approaches that we've discussed so far. First of all, a lot of countries that mention women or gender in top-level cybersecurity strategies focus on workforce training. And this is a very common theme. Every country wants more trained cybersecurity professionals, right? And I think it is very obvious that, if you want more trained cybersecurity professionals, you go to the sector of the population that is underrepresented in the cybersecurity workforce. So there is some of that going on, but at the same time, we're not talking about curtailing abuse. And I think when we talk about, operator fatigue or emotional costs of being in that space, right? Even being in an industry where in some cases, women tend to get overlooked for promotions, where the working conditions are not ideal really for anybody, right? But that's also something that comes into part and parcel of this as well. Similarly, education tends to focus on teaching women and girls how to navigate technology, but less so on teaching men and boys how to be part of the solution. And especially when we think about things like emerging and very problematic uses of generative AI technology for image-based abuse, right? Arguably, there is some intervention to be had there as well. Another thing that I thought was really just interesting to me when I looked at comparing different cybersecurity strategies is how gender was handled in a lot of national cyber strategies versus age. So as I mentioned, right, only about 20% or less really of the national cybersecurity strategies mention women, but almost every national cybersecurity strategy out of those that I looked at mentions youth populations or the elderly. Why? Because we care about, child exploitation and abuse, child pornography online. Those are major concerns for a lot of countries. For some countries with aging populations, it is also considered very strategically important that we educate populations more about, good cyber hygiene and things like that. What I thought was really interesting is that, as a factor of difference, right, age receives a lot more extensive and nuanced treatment in cyber strategies than either gender or race, which incidentally, race and ethnicity was mentioned far less even than gender in these cybersecurity strategies. So one of the things that I would argue based on this, right, is that when we see mention of elderly populations or children and national cyber strategies, we're often talking about them as populations that could be brought into the workforce, but populations that also face specific risks online. So that's what I mean when I talk about nuance, right? Because I think when we do see gender mentioned, there seems to be a heavy focus on, put more women in the workforce, right? But not necessarily perceive that there are abuses that prevent that from happening as well. Who's watching industry players, right? That's something that's out there as well. So there's always going to be a public-private tension in these cybersecurity strategies and policies as well. And gender could be brought into that too. So just a couple of takeaways from all of this, and again, look forward to having the conversation afterwards. But some takeaways here are thinking about cybersecurity in a more inclusive way that centers the experience of communities and individuals, and not just that cybersecurity is a very state-driven or military-driven sort of thing alone. Taking targeted online violence seriously is a part of that as well. Understanding the extent of the problem, I imagine that, one of the common themes of this panel is that everybody is going to say we need better data on something, right? We need better data on victimization. We need better data on targeted abuse. We need better data on the experience of working in the cybersecurity field and the impact that has on people. So there's data work to be done everywhere. Potential protections against data harvesting may become progressively more important in the future, especially related to conversations we're having about generative AI. Intellectual property concerns related to that are huge. Questioning the entrenched dominance of big tech firms comes as part of that as well. And also understanding how one of the most interesting things I've done in the past couple of years, I edited a book that we specifically wanted to talk to authors, academics, practitioners from places throughout the global South to see what they experienced as the biggest cybersecurity threats in their regions. We had a chapter that was submitted from someone who was an NGO worker in Afghanistan, and her number one concern was data harvesting, right, and data protection, and what has happened to all of that data that was collected on Afghan citizens, when Afghanistan becomes a country that's dominated by the Taliban again. One of the other interesting responses that we had was from academics in Kenya and South Africa, who basically said that morality laws in those countries have prevented women from being involved in online commerce, right? Because there are so many ways to be accused of indecency and violations of morality law that it keeps women from engaging in this kind of new information community that we want to build. And the other big thing is things like cyber weapons, like Pegasus, for those of you who know about it, right? The misuse of a tool like that, which was designed for counterterrorism purposes, which was only supposed to be used by good countries for counterterrorism purposes, and instead it gets into the hands of authoritarian countries who use it to spy on civil society actors and government critics, including women's rights activists in countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, India, and even Mexico as well. Questions about the absence of women, minorities, LGBTQ populations from cyber policy. This is another, I think, arguably takeaway of this panel is thinking about, who is and is not represented in the industry. So yeah, these are all things that I think we can talk about more in the Q&A. So I'll leave off there. Incidentally, that first book is the book that I mentioned where we had chapters and contributions from people throughout the global South about their perceptions on cybersecurity. So I'd be happy to talk about that more too, if anyone's interested. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Buitta.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for showing up for this session. I think it's important to disclaim that I'm not an academic, and I don't mean that as an insult, but
We just gave you a talk.
I know. So I've ceded my time to the other panelists if I can't keep talking. But I'm honestly used to being with teenagers. We work with middle-aged and high school girls, and so we're really activated on the ground. I'm very much a practitioner. So my hope is that I can add some insights into the work that we do every day to help sort of illuminate some of the issues that have been discussed. So this theme is sort of centering experiences of girls globally in WPS and cybersecurity. And like a non-academic, I created slides and nothing I say will track with the slides. So I'm just going to flip back and forth and hope that you find some of it useful. So talking a little bit about centering girls' experiences, examining the intersection of security, technology, and defense. I think my colleague here beautifully touched on tech-facilitated harms. And then exploring some solutions. And I think really the basic premise that Dr. Hudson's work touches on, which has really provided a theoretical framework for girls' security, is truly validating that the security experiences of girls should be part of our national security calculus and not an afterthought. And I sort of refer to girls as canaries in the coal mine, which is not a great way to frame it, but they oftentimes are, especially in the digital domain, the first population to experience harms that then become much broader at scale, much later in sort of the development of these technologies. So just briefly, girls' security is focused on workforce development, starting primarily in high school. We have a workforce training program. We also do a lot of work with strategic partnerships with UN Women, NATO, and others to sort of help design tools. So we've worked with Afghan girls who were resettled here in the United States, and unfortunately were given iPhones and were posting a lot of personal images of themselves online with their locational data not hidden. And so there was a lot of just sort of baseline setting with this population of girls that was so excited to engage with TikTok and Instagram, but didn't realize that they were actually creating security concerns for their parents. We've also designed toolkits for UN Women for teenage girls throughout Southeast Asia, which have been translated, I think, into 9 or 10 languages at this point, where again, young people, because of access of technology, are taking their iPhones to and from places and not thinking about locational and other considerations, which makes them more vulnerable to human trafficking and other types of harms. And then we also work with at-risk youth throughout the United States. We work very deeply on the south side of Chicago, which is where I'm from. And there it's similar patterns, again, at scale with important cultural distinctions, which is where you have statistically, 1 out of every 5 girls has experienced sexual violence before the age of 14. So you're already dealing with a population that is vulnerable. And oftentimes with these populations, what we see is especially the girls who've experienced sexual violence, they're more likely to be victimized again because of their experiences. And so to sort of, support this frustration with the tech community, girls' harms just are not part of our calculus. And what will change that, I think, is conversations like this. But I think the national security community has a really special place. So I'm going to just stop there and go to my remarks because I don't want to forget things that I have to say. And again, usually I can fly by the seat of my pants with teenagers, but I feel like you're a serious crowd. So, I've worked at the intersection of national security, WPS, civil rights, technology for over 20 years. And I feel very confident in saying that we are at the cusp of so much tremendous innovation with technology, with artificial intelligence, with the impacts of quantum computing. We sort of envision in our alternative futures forecasting, which is our way of bringing girls' experiences to the national security calculus. We're sort of imagining a future in which AI is so ubiquitous that we need to develop new theories of cognition. We're sort of challenging the boundaries of national security and bringing girls and young women alongside us as we do that with practitioners like you. But we're also at a time where the level and sort of depth of inequities across the United States and globally just continue to grow. If you are not following the state of the U.S. education system, it is pretty grim. And there was a report last week that all young people have fallen back to a baseline in 1995 in terms of achievements in math and science. And all of the gender gaps that we've seen between boys and girls in math and science have reemerged. So at least from girls' security's perspective, while we do engage at the middle school level, we feel there's an important opportunity to recapture that interest in high school, which is typically when they're sort of career planning. And just to respond to a point that was mentioned, our model acknowledges that filling rooms with more women is not the solution. Which is why we situate the workforce piece alongside the amplification of their voice and solution spaces as sort of our best moral and ethical commitment to the work that we do, because you may be surprised or not, but we have a lot of people who come to us and say, how can you recruit girls and women into national security given that they're likely to be raped or sexually assaulted or experience a hostile work environment? We get that comment a lot. Of course, I just come back with find a sector in which women aren't subject to those types of harms. But what I will say, in to response to a comment earlier, is girls, the data says it, but we see it every day in our work. They are so purpose driven. I mean, almost 100% of the girls in our program come in and they want a job with purpose. National security is that place for them, but we can't go at them how we as practitioners would go at them, which is why everything you see that Girl Security designs is designed by teenage girls. Everything that we do is identity centered. Everything that we do is culturally responsive. Everything that we do has social and emotional frameworks incorporated into it, because that's what young people need to feel accepted and belonging in spaces like this where we need them. And so I often say I'm 4 or 5 kids. So by the time my parents got to me, my television sort of raised me. So I really like movies. And have you seen the movie The Crow with Brandon Lee, who's like one of my favorites? There's a scene in which Eric, who's the sort of main character, is transfusing the harms and the murder of his fiancée to the investigating sergeant. And that scene from that movie always sticks with me, because I wish with all of you, if you don't have access to this kind of work, I could transfuse to you the harms that we see on the ground with girls across the United States and globally. I think it would just, to use their term, hit differently if you could walk alongside them as they're experiencing these things, but also with the harms also comes the wave of resilience, the ways in which they sort of dust themselves off to become part of a solution, knowing that every sort of aspect of how they live is working against them, is, I think, one of the most remarkable sort of feats of resilience that I've ever seen in my career. And, we continue to see this on the ground. And as I said, we worked with a population of girls from Afghanistan, and not only did we train them, but they said, we want to write something for your audience about why girls are so needed in national security. So 9 of them wrote beautiful essays, sort of sharing the experience of being evacuated and really trying to impress upon all of us why their voices mattered. Why did the Taliban close girls' schools? Because, to Dr. Hudson's point, they knew that that's the first sign of progress. So it's, you'll keep hearing me say that throughout the course of my comments, but I think it's so important to not just think about the sort of adding numbers and mixing in, but actually thinking about their experiences. So with that, I think one of the distinctions is important, which I think the Women, Peace, and Security framework can actually deepen. And this is probably much more social science informed in the United States, but it's distinguishing the experiences of girlhood. That's a girl in our program from DC this summer, and they're actually they're doing a design thinking challenge around deepfake, the use of deepfakes, which increased 300%, by the way, against teenage girls in the past year. Girlhood is its sort of own set of experiences. So unlike boys and men, girls and women are sort of always like lumped together, and we assume that their experiences are shared. And so one of the things that we can add to this conversation is really distinguishing the experiences of girlhood as part of how we think about women, peace, and security, and how we think about specifically harms against girls and women. And I think the part that we talk about at Girl Security is that national security is the most powerful political realm in the world. And we often say decisions made in the name of national security shape our entire world, not just the United States. And our defense sector, as you know, drives technological innovation, yet a lot of these same advances, some of which have been discussed, present complex challenges when they're commercialized. So we had a lot of dual use technologies that, in our haste to become technologically, have technological supremacy, we don't just stop and think, what might these technologies do to the most vulnerable of populations? So something that we use, which I think can be helpful, is called the curb cut effect, which is if you're designing things with the most vulnerable population in mind, it's statistically proven to improve the outcomes of those uses for other populations. And we know that things like smartphones become an instrument of deepfake technology, We know that locational data, we know that the internet, all of these tools have not only been used to sort of serve a national security purpose, they have these secondary harms. And one example that I often give in the context of just GPS is the case of Strava, the running app. How many of you have used Strava? So Strava is an app that you use for running or different exercise routes. And shortly after the app was developed and published, women who had been stalked were writing to the company and calling on the company to review its privacy policies and its locational settings. So this went on for about 3 years, and the company did nothing. And then all of a sudden, it was revealed that the Department of Defense data that soldiers were using Strava on the different military bases, and people were able to actually track their running paths. And Strava was like, oh, okay, well, yes, now we'll do something about it. And it's not to say that DoD isn't more important or less important, but it's the fact that girls and women were experiencing these harms. They were sounding the alarm and no one was listening. And it could have actually spared and corrected for that other security breach. And so one of the questions that we often ask ourselves at Girl Security is, girls have every reason they are disenfranchised. If you look at the sort of patterns that underlie online radicalization, terrorism, girls and young women have every reason to be violent, and they aren't. And so we often ask ourselves, if girls started to organize and radicalize, would we care more about the harms against them? And I put that to you. What do you think as practitioners? I can go Socratic, so what do you think? Do you think we would care more if girls became violent?
Maybe we could put that into the Q&A.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what people think. So I think the Women, Peace, and Security agenda provides us an opportunity for intervention. But we have to deepen the scope, because I think the reality is that the security threats to girls manifest in really diverse ways, in ways in which technology is moving so quickly, it's difficult to keep up, which is why I think having additional data calls is so critical. We know for a fact with sextortion, which actually targets teenage boys more than young women, the Department of Justice sort of acknowledged that the level of data it was gathering was just wholly incomplete. So there was no way that the data they were gathering could actually inform better solutions or strategies to counter sextortion online. And I think if there is a solution, which one of the other guests we were talking about before, I don't believe there are solutions to these challenges. I think there are better strategies we can employ, but it definitely it requires a fundamental shift in how we think about security innovation. We have to expand our security framework, which I think is what the WPS agenda allows for, but I think we could deepen it with the experiences of girlhood. And again, it means incorporating girls' lived experiences at the earliest inception of not only technological development, because we rely so heavily, the national security community relies so heavily on the private sector technology providers to develop those technologies. It has to come from our national security leadership. It has to be a first instance, a first consideration before a bid is issued for a technology that can do X, Y, and Z. It has to be top in mind, because by the time it hits the marketplace, the people designing the technologies are not thinking about girls and women. People regulating the technologies may not be representing those perspectives, and the people using the technologies are not aware of or not thinking about the implications of that. And I guess I would say the last thing is, I'm trying to think of something that is complementary to what the other panelists would say, but I guess I would say our experience at Girl Security has been that it's not enough for us to just talk about harms against girls and women, because people have been talking about them for a really long time. But I think the point that I would end on, that again, I think Dr. Hudson beautifully frames, is it's a competitive advantage to think about harms against girls specifically also within the cybersecurity domain, because they truly are on the front lines. And if we can include their perspectives and voices at those earliest instances, and if we can think about building workplaces that value the perspective that girls and women bring, I will tell you that, and it's not an us versus them dialogue, there's literally no one else I'd rather have in my corner than a group of teenage girls who have endured what they have and still show up to our program and say, I want to be a Marine. I want to be a CIA agent. I want to work for Microsoft to design, a new threat hunting perspective. Girls in our program that have lived in the jungles in foreign countries and have been victimized, saying, I want to develop AI microorganisms that can go in and catch the cartels. They are, it's so cliche, but they are a national security superpower that we are completely forgetting. And we always have an opportunity. The door is never shut. We always have an opportunity to engage girls and young women. But again, I think it's a matter of meeting them when they are. And then the last thing I wanted to add, since we're going to open up to questions, was talked about, you mentioned this, how gender was treated within the cybersecurity strategies. And I think part of the problem is we're so uncomfortable talking about sexual violence as a country. We don't want to talk about it. I was a victim of sexual violence by my employer working in national security, which I didn't realize would become part of Girl Security's mission, except that so many young women in our program, so many women in our program would come forward with their stories. We have to be able to become comfortable talking about sexual violence, and we have to be able to become comfortable talking about misogyny. I think this whole narrative around we don't want to talk about misogyny, which is something that we hear in this sort of not all men. If we don't name it, if we don't define it, if we don't qualify it, provide indicators for it, it's uncomfortable. But if we show people what misogyny actually looks like, and we have plenty of case studies from terrorism and other domains, I think that could open up a door to a much more fruitful conversation on a lot of these issues. So that's.
Thank you. It is the prerogative of the moderator to steal a couple of minutes from Q&A, and of course I would never give that up. So I want to ask an important question of my panel. Why should anyone in this room care? It's a serious question, because it is a serious pushback to not just WPS, but to discussions of that in cybersecurity. And in that regard, let's get even more blunt. What do women in cyber do for us that men can't do? So that's one part. Now, before I let them answer this deliberately provocative question, I'm going to give you a couple of points. First one, about 20 years ago, they did a study of 13-year-old boys and girls in the US, Germany, and Japan, and they found out that math verbal skills are entirely culturally derived. Entirely culturally derived. In the United States, the US girls, and this was 20 years ago, were better than in verbs. We always say talkers, right? They're better in verbal skills, and the boys are better in math skills. The Germans and boys are better in both. And in Japan, there was no statistical difference. Culturally derived. Second point I want to make. A colleague of mine is a program manager in DARPA. And I've told this story to others, and they were doing a project on using AI to determine whether an oncoming individual was a threat. And they were using the characteristic of, are they carrying a gun? They were very proud of their program, and they brought their program to her. And she said something like, have you thought about cultural context? And they said, what? And she said, a person carrying a gun in Texas, an open carry state, versus a person carrying a gun in DC, decidedly not open carry. And they went, ooh, and went back. Why does it matter? Because one of the things women do offer is that by and large, this is an ideal type, but by and large, women lean towards context-oriented individuals, whereas males tend to be more focused on the outcome that they've already been focused on to begin with. So when women are introduced into boardrooms, into corporate headquarters, and so on, you tend to see a difference in terms of their investments, their willingness to take risks that are unnecessary, and other advantages. See how I'm trying to answer my own question before they do. And the final one is there is well-established literature on the economic prosperity of societies when women are educated to the basic levels of that society. Now, what will happen in the future if we are not educating our women in a fundamentally cyber or digitized society in which those skills are part of what makes us prosperous, right? That is absolutely a strategic, that's a strategy for a downfall. Now that I've done that, I'm going to mix it up a bit. I'm going to ask Alexis first, and then Anne, and then Lauren.
Okay. I have 3 answers to your question that I would put
Yay.
forward, right? Based on what we've heard here, right? I think the first thing, combining the answer to the why care question, right? And the what do women do for us question. I mean, I think that we've heard the sort of canary in the coal mine example, right? A couple of times here, right? The notion that, on the one hand, right, we should be stopping things like the abuse of location data, and how that harms women, or the use of like smart tags or AI abuse against women. We should be stopping that just for moral reasons, right? Because it's right to stop that. But also there is a strategic reason for that as well, because the abuse of location data against victims of domestic violence does not stop there. And when you don't stop that for like 3 years, guess what happens? It starts to become a national security issue because the skills are being transferred. Now, compare that to the sort of generative AI image-based abuse kind of thing that we're seeing right now. Right now, we're seeing those systems being used to target, women and girls for things like nudification or fake pornography or whatever. What does that look like in 3 years, right? What does it look like, and what consequences does that have for elections, for democracy, for civil society, things like that? So that's one answer, right? And including women in cybersecurity would arguably help to spot those blind spots that we have had a little bit earlier. So that's the what women in cyber do for us thing. But the other answer I would give that is, I think, maybe a little bit more of a holistic answer is thinking about what Dr. Hudson talked about earlier today, right? Which is the ramifications, right? And the sort of outward ripple effect of something like the first political order, right? And when she's talking about it in terms of states, you're starting with, misogyny or, patriarchy in these states, and that's rippling out to all kinds of effects like, the economic effects, the class stratification in societies. It's affecting a tremendous amount of outcome indicators in terms of state performance. What does that look like for cyberspace, right? When we take a more sort of nebulous approach to cyberspace as a domain, what is that first political order doing in cyberspace that is then rippling out to create a lot of the problems that we have right now, where the cyberspace that we envisioned, right, the cyberspace that cyber utopians want us to be able to reach, right, it is not what we have, right? And increasingly we have, sort of territorialization, we have new forms of abuse coming out all the time, those sorts of things. So I think that those are, those would be my sort of 3 reasons for thinking about that.
You're very thorough, so I don't know that I can add too much more there. I will go back to the canary in the coal mine, and also the comment on the distinction of girlhood and womanhood, and that those are sort of unique perspectives. And I really loved that. Men can't provide those women's perspectives in the space. So, what can women uniquely bring? It's not a technical skills thing or a soft skills thing. It's a perspective thing, and a lived experience. And I would use that to answer the sort of why should anybody care? Because if you don't have that lived experience and you're not bringing that into your product development, your policy development, your operational planning, you cannot be successful, because you're only accounting for half of the population and ignoring the other half. So
I'm going to answer with 2 questions. I think this really gets to something that was touched on earlier. Russia and China have made it very clear who they are. And to me, this issue gets to who is America? Who are we? Do we value the entirety of our population in participating in the most important common cause or not? And I think the other question, because I really prefer not to answer what women uniquely contribute, because then I think we sort of have to do the other side of it. So I might frame it as, what do we give up or what do we forego if we don't engage the majority of the population in this critical space?
I want to thank our panel very much for this wonderful opportunity. And as you can see, they're also open to any questions and follow on. And I highly recommend that you do that if this interests you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Please warmly applaud our panelists for most interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion this afternoon. Panelists, thank you especially for your time this week and all preparation and travel you've gone through to be part of the 11th annual WPS Symposium. This concludes this afternoon's session of our WPS Symposium.